The day the silence broke, the morning sun rose gently over Delhi, painting the rooftops in soft gold as a slow breeze carried the scent of chai and rain-soaked earth. It was the kind of morning that felt calm on the surface but hid quiet storms underneath. SundarPichai's car moved silently through the busy streets, his face calm, his thoughts deep. The CEO of Google rarely allowed himself to pause. His schedule was filled with meetings, interviews, and endless screens. But today was different. Today he was back in India not as a businessman, but as a man who wanted to listen, to learn, and to understand. The air around him buzzed with news. The Prime Minister was hosting a private session with a few select visionaries to discuss India's digital future. Sundar had been invited personally. It wasn't the first time he had met Modi ji, but something inside him felt different today. Maybe it was the fatigue in the nation's eyes after years of rebuilding, or maybe it was the quiet exhaustion he had seen even in the strongest leaders. Whatever it was, Sundar felt a sense of purpose that went beyond business. He wasn't here to talk about profit. He was here to talk about people. When he entered the Prime Minister's residence, everything looked calm. Security personnel standing firm, advisors moving quickly, screens glowing with data. Yet the moment Sundar stepped inside the main chamber, he noticed something that made him stop. Modi ji sat alone at the far end of the long wooden table. His shoulders slightly slumped, his hand pressed against his forehead. Papers surrounded him, reports, charts, and handwritten notes. It was rare to see him still. His usual energy, his powerful presence, it all seemed muted. The room was quiet except for the ticking of a clock. Sundar hesitated before stepping closer, unsure if he should speak. When Modi ji finally looked up, there was a tired smile on his face, one that tried to hide weariness but failed to conceal the truth. Sundar had seen that look before, in engineers who had worked through the night, in parents struggling to keep hope alive for their children, in himself when he carried the weight of too many expectations. "You're here early," Modi ji said softly. "I thought you might be tired from your flight." Sundar smiled gently. "I wanted to see you before the meeting started. I thought it might be quieter now." "Quieter," Modi ji repeated with a faint nod. "Yes, it's quiet. Sometimes too quiet." For a long moment, neither spoke. There was no formality, no media, no cameras. Just two men from different worlds sitting in the same silence. Sundar noticed the Prime Minister's tea had gone cold. The cup was untouched. He remembered how years ago his mother would always insist that no one should drink cold tea. It meant something was being ignored. Someone was not paying attention. That simple thought stirred something in him. "You haven't touched your tea," Sundar said quietly. Modi ji gave a tired chuckle. "There's no time for tea when the country doesn't sleep." The words were meant to be light, but Sundar heard the truth beneath them. Exhaustion, perhaps loneliness. The world saw leaders as unbreakable symbols, but they were human too. Sundar stepped closer, pulling out a chair beside him instead of across from him. It was a small gesture, but one that changed the energy in the room. He wasn't there as a guest now. He was there as a friend. "You know," Sundar said slowly, "at Google we often talk about how technology connects people, but sometimes I feel we forget to connect ourselves. We keep building faster systems, smarter networks, but we forget that the most powerful connection is still human empathy." Modi ji looked at him curiously. "You think we've lost that?" Sundar thought for a moment before replying. "I think we've buried it under work, under expectations. We think progress means always moving forward, but sometimes progress means pausing, just to breathe." There was a silence after that. A deep one. The kind that doesn't feel empty but full of the things unsaid, the emotions buried too long. Sundar noticed how Modi ji's eyes softened slightly, the tension in his face fading, even if just for a second. "You sound like someone who's been thinking about this for a long time," the Prime Minister said with a faint smile. "I suppose I have," Sundar admitted. "There's something I've learned leading thousands of people. No matter how advanced we get, no matter how many problems we solve, people still need one thing more than answers. They need to feel seen." It was strange. The most powerful man in the country and one of the most influential tech leaders in the world sitting together, not discussing economics or innovation, but the quiet need for humanity. Outside, the city was awake, horns, traffic, the hum of millions. But in that room, it felt as if time had paused. After a few minutes, a young assistant entered. holding a tray of documents and a new cup of steaming tea. She looked nervous, aware of who she was standing before. Sundar noticed her hands shaking slightly as she placed the cup down. One of the papers slipped from the stack and fluttered to the ground. She quickly bent to pick it up, apologizing under her breath. Before she could, Sundar bent down too and picked up the paper for her. The girl froze, shocked. The Prime Minister himself looked surprised. Sundar handed it back with a gentle smile, saying, "Don't worry, it happens." The young woman looked at him with wide eyes, whispered a soft "thank you," and left quietly. Modi Ji's gaze lingered on Sundar for a moment, thoughtful. "Most people would have let her do it," he said slowly. "You didn't have to." "That's exactly why I did," Sundar replied softly. "Sometimes the smallest gestures say the most." Modi Ji leaned back in his chair, his eyes reflecting something deeper now. Maybe respect, maybe realization. He looked at Sundar and said, "You remind me that humility is a language we should never forget, no matter how high we rise." For the first time that morning, the room felt warm again. Sundar smiled, but deep down he knew something else was stirring, something he couldn't quite define. There was a heaviness in Modi Ji's voice that went beyond fatigue. Something was weighing on him, and Sundar could sense it. "Is everything all right?" Sundar asked quietly. "You seem distracted." Modi Ji hesitated, his eyes falling on the papers in front of him. One of them was marked with red ink. A report about rising unemployment, digital exclusion in rural areas, the emotional toll of constant change. He sighed. "The truth," he said after a pause, "is that progress comes with shadows. People expect strength from you every second. They forget that you are human. Some nights I look at these numbers, these struggles, and I wonder if I'm doing enough." The honesty in his voice stunned Sundar. He wasn't hearing the polished words of a leader. He was hearing the quiet pain of a man who carried millions of dreams on his shoulders. Sundar felt a deep empathy. He knew that weight in his own way. "You are," Sundar said gently. "But no one can carry everything alone." The words hung between them like a fragile truth. Outside, the sound of a siren echoed faintly, a reminder that the world never stopped. But in that quiet space, something profound had shifted. Two men, different paths, same purpose. Then Modi Ji looked at Sundar with tired but determined eyes and said, "You've come here for more than a meeting, haven't you?" Sundar nodded slowly. "I've come here to offer something. Not as Google's CEO, but as someone who still believes in the power of kindness." Modi Ji tilted his head slightly, curious. "And what is that?" Sundar smiled faintly. "A plan that might just change how people connect across this country." The Prime Minister leaned forward. "Tell me." But before Sundar could speak, an advisor suddenly entered, looking tense. "Sir, there's an urgent situation developing," he said, handing a phone to Modi Ji. The color drained slightly from the Prime Minister's face as he read the message on the screen. He looked at Sundar, his voice low. "We might need that kindness of yours sooner than you think." And just like that, the air in the room thickened with tension. Sundar didn't yet know what was happening, but he could feel it. Something was about to test everything he believed in. The call that changed everything as the door closed behind the tense advisor. The stillness that had filled the room vanished. Sundar could feel it immediately. The sudden shift. The invisible weight of urgency pressing into the air. Modi Ji looked down at the phone again, reading the message once more as if hoping it would somehow change. His eyes tightened, his posture straightened, and the quiet fatigue that had softened his face only moments ago disappeared beneath the familiar resolve of a leader. Sundar had seen it before, the way responsibility could transform a man in seconds. "What happened?" Sundar asked softly, though a part of him already feared the answer. Modi Ji handed him the phone without a word. On the screen was a message from one of the rural ministry directors. Heavy monsoon rains had flooded several villages in the northern belt, destroying homes, power lines, and, most importantly, internet connectivity. Thousands of people were cut off, unable to reach their families, unable to call for help. The digital infrastructure that had connected the nation had gone silent where it mattered most. It wasn't just a crisis of technology, it was a crisis of humanity. "It's not just the flooding," Modi Ji said quietly. "They've lost communication. Our local teams can't send updates. It's chaos." Sundar stared at the screen, the image of still waters and fallen towers flashing in his mind. He'd seen disaster before, but this felt personal. India's digital growth had always been close to his heart. He had dreamed of connecting every village, giving every child access to knowledge, every farmer a voice, every woman a chance to build a future. and now that dream was being drowned by rain. "I can help," Sundar said immediately. The words came out before he had even fully thought them through, but he knew they were true. Modi looked up, searching his eyes. "How?" Sundar took a deep breath. "We have emergency connectivity technology. Portable satellite links that can bring back signal in remote areas, even during disasters. They were meant for internal crisis testing, but if you give me the clearance, we can deploy them now." For a long moment, Modi said nothing. Then slowly he nodded. "Do it." It was a simple command, but it carried the weight of trust. Within minutes, Sundar was on the phone, coordinating across continents, calling engineers in California, Delhi, and Bangalore. His calm voice moved through the chaos, giving clear instructions. Modi watched silently, his earlier exhaustion replaced by admiration. There was something grounding in seeing a man who didn't shout or panic but simply acted, with focus, humility, and purpose. An hour later, a plan began to form. Drones would carry portable communication nodes into the affected zones. Local teams would anchor them on temporary power units. With luck, they could restore signal to key areas within 12 hours. But as Sundar gave the final instructions, a message came through his private phone, one that stopped him cold. His mother's village was among those hit. For the first time, his calm faltered. He stared at the screen, his heart sinking. His mother had insisted on staying in their ancestral home, a small village surrounded by hills and rice fields. It was where Sundar had spent his childhood, barefoot and wide-eyed before life had carried him far away. He hadn't been there in years, and now he couldn't reach her. "Is something wrong?" Modi asked, noticing the change in his expression. Sundar hesitated, then nodded. "My mother lives in one of those villages." The Prime Minister's gaze softened. For a brief moment, the lines between personal and political disappeared. He placed a hand on Sundar's shoulder and said quietly, "Then we will reach her first." Those words, spoken with quiet resolve, reignited something deep in Sundar's heart. This wasn't about a project anymore. It was about family, about roots, about the invisible thread that tied one person's story to a nation's. As the team began to move, Sundar insisted on accompanying the deployment unit himself. Modi tried to protest. He was the head of one of the world's largest companies. But Sundar shook his head. "I can't lead from afar. Not this time." By the time their convoy reached the airfield, the sky had grown dark, heavy clouds hanging low like restless spirits. The rain fell in sharp waves, drumming against the glass. The aircraft engines roared as technicians loaded equipment, marked with Google's emergency division tags. Sundar climbed aboard, his face lit by the faint glow of his tablet screen. Every message he sent carried urgency, but beneath the precision of his words, his heart was trembling with worry. As they lifted off into the storm, he looked out through the rain-smeared window. The lightning flashed across the clouds, illuminating the earth below. He thought about the children in those villages, the farmers standing knee-deep in water, the elders praying by candlelight. He thought of his mother, her gentle hands, her quiet laughter, her belief that kindness was stronger than fear. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not after all the years he had promised himself he would return. When they landed at a nearby military base, the power was out. Only faint emergency lights glowed in the mist. Soldiers and engineers worked side by side, unpacking the equipment. The ground was muddy, the air heavy with tension. Sundar didn't wait for protocol. He rolled up his sleeves, lifted boxes, checked cables, worked beside everyone else. At first, the soldiers were hesitant to let him, but when they saw the determination in his eyes, they no longer questioned who he was. They only followed his lead. Hours passed in relentless effort. Rainwater streamed across the ground, soaking their boots. Lightning cracked above them, but no one stopped. Sundar's voice carried through the noise. Steady, focused, calm. "Anchor that unit there. Check the signal output. We're almost there." It was past midnight when finally one of the monitors blinked to life. A weak but steady signal had returned. For the first time in days, a voice from the flood zone came through the radio. A young boy's voice, trembling, scared, but alive. "Hello? Can you hear us? Please, we need help." Everyone froze. Then a cheer broke through the darkness. They had done it. One connection, one lifeline restored. Sundar exhaled deeply, his body shaking from exhaustion and relief. But his hands were already reaching for the next console. "Trace that signal," he said. "Find out which area it's from." When the coordinates appeared on the screen, His breath caught. It was his mother's village. The flood had reached the lower part of the valley, and according to the weak transmission, dozens were trapped in the community hall waiting for rescue. He felt his heart squeeze painfully. She was there. She was alive. But for how long, he didn't know. As dawn began to break through the clouds, a faint light spreading across the soaked landscape, Sundar stepped outside. The air was cold, heavy with mist, but the horizon shimmered with the first touch of gold. Howdy's voice came through the secure line, steady but filled with emotion. "I heard the signal came from your village," he said. "What do you plan to do?" Sundar looked out at the horizon, where the light slowly rose from darkness. "I'm going there," he said quietly. "I need to see her, and I need to make sure no one is left behind." Modiji didn't try to stop him. Instead, he said something that stayed with Sundar for the rest of his life. "You've built bridges of data and code across the world. Now go build one of humanity." And as Sundar climbed into the rescue chopper, soaked, tired, and filled with purpose, he felt something deep inside him shift. It wasn't just a mission anymore. It was a journey back to where everything had started, the place that had given him dreams, values, and strength. He didn't know what he would find there, but he knew one thing for sure. This was no longer about technology. It was about heart. The road home, the chopper blade sliced through the wet morning air as the sky above India began to clear. Dawn spilled across the land like liquid gold, touching the flooded valleys and silent villages below. Sundar sat near the open window, his clothes still damp, his eyes fixed on the landscape that had once been his childhood home. Every patch of green, every curve of the river carried a memory. The rusted bridge where he used to fish with his father, the narrow lane where his mother sold sweets during festivals, the old school roof that leaked every monsoon. It all came rushing back like pieces of a forgotten dream. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset. "Sir, we'll reach your mother's village in 20 minutes. Water levels are high. We may need to land on the outskirts." Sundar nodded silently. His heart was pounding, not from fear but from a deep ache of longing. It had been years since he'd walked those streets. He had left as a boy with nothing but ambition, and returned now as a man burdened by both power and humility. The world knew him as the CEO of one of the biggest companies in history, but in this moment none of that mattered. He wasn't SundarPichai, the leader of Google. He was Sundar, the son of Lakshmi Pichai, the boy who once dreamed of touching the stars while sitting on the mud floor of a small home. When they descended near the village edge, the view was heartbreaking. Houses were half submerged in brown water, trees bent under the weight of the storm, and smoke rose faintly from a broken transformer. Villagers were gathered on higher ground, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Children clung to their mothers, elders prayed quietly, and young men tried to move debris with bare hands. The air was thick with despair, but also with resilience. People were helping each other despite having lost almost everything. As Sundar stepped off the chopper, the soldiers immediately surrounded him for safety, but he waved them off gently. "No guards," he said softly. "These are my people." The villagers turned as he walked toward them, unsure who he was at first. His simple jacket and muddy shoes didn't reveal his identity. Then one old man squinted, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Is that Sundar?" "Sundar from school, no." "4," he whispered. Another woman gasped, covering her mouth. Within moments, a ripple of recognition spread through the crowd. Murmurs turned to cries of joy and shock. "Sundar Beta," one elderly woman called out, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "You came back." And then, through the chaos, he saw her, his mother, standing on the steps of the community hall holding a young child in her arms. Her sari was wet, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes still shone with the same warmth that had carried him through every hardship. Sundar froze, his throat tightening. For a second he couldn't move. Then she saw him too, and the child slipped from her arms as she whispered his name. Sundar. Before she began to walk toward him through the shallow water, the world blurred. The crowd faded. Only the sound of their footsteps splashing in the flood remained. When they finally reached each other, she touched his face gently as if afraid he might disappear if she blinked. "You're really here," she said softly. "My boy came home." He knelt down, taking her hands into his. They were cold, rough, and trembling. "I came as fast as I could," he whispered. "I saw the news. I had to make sure you were safe." She smiled weakly. "The house is gone," she said, her voice calm despite the tragedy. "But the people are alive. That's what matters." Sundar looked around. Volunteers were distributing supplies, some of his engineers setting up portable stations to restore internet access. The once silent phones of the villagers began to ring, connecting families who had been lost to one another for days. Cries of joy echoed through the village as people spoke to loved ones for the first time since the flood. Sundar watched it unfold with tears in his eyes. It wasn't just technology at work. It was hope reborn through compassion and effort. His mother's voice broke through his thoughts. "You always wanted to build something that changed lives," she said softly. "Now you have," he shook his head. "No, Amma. They're the ones who changed me. I forgot what it meant to serve, not just to succeed." She looked at him quietly, her gaze gentle but knowing. "You always remembered, Sundar. You just needed to come home to feel it again." Before he could reply, one of the engineers ran up, breathless. "Sir, the connection nodes are stable, but the northern section is still without power. We're trying to reach them manually." Sundar turned to him. "How far?" "About 5 kilometers, sir." The bridge collapsed. "It's dangerous," he didn't hesitate. "Then we go on foot." The soldiers tried to protest. "Sir, it's not safe. These people don't have a choice," Sundar said firmly. "So neither do we." His mother touched his arm, her eyes filled with both pride and fear. "Be careful, my son," she whispered. "The world still needs hearts like yours." As Sundar and the small rescue team began their trek through the flooded road, the rain started again, light at first, then heavier. The water reached their knees, then their waists. They carried the equipment high above their heads, wading through the current. Every step was slow, every breath heavy. The path that once led to his school was now a river, the playground buried beneath murky waves. Sundar looked around at the devastation and felt an ache deep within his soul. Progress had brought them power, but nature reminded them who truly ruled the earth. They finally reached the northern edge near dusk. The sky burned orange and red against the rising mist. Children and elders were trapped on rooftops, waving frantically. Sundar shouted instructions, helping the soldiers set up rope lines to pull them across one by one. A small girl slipped in the current, screaming, and without a thought, Sundar jumped in after her. The cold water hit like knives, but he pushed forward, grabbed her arm, and lifted her above the surface. She cried against his shoulder as he carried her to safety. The soldiers pulled them both to shore. Sundar was shivering, soaked to the bone, but when the child smiled weakly and whispered, "Thank you," every drop of cold felt worth it. He wrapped his jacket around her and watched as her mother rushed forward to embrace her. It was in that moment, as the mother wept into her child's hair, that Sundar truly understood what Modi had said earlier. Build one of humanity. It wasn't about machines or software or innovation. It was about this. About saving one life, bringing one family back together, restoring one spark of faith. Technology could change the world, but only if it remembered the heartbeat behind every number, the tear behind every screen. When the last person had been rescued and the power finally flickered back to life, Sundar stood at the hill overlooking the village. The streetlights came on one by one, dim but steady, like small stars returning to the earth. People were cheering, hugging, crying. His mother stood below, watching him with pride. Then his phone buzzed. It was Modi again. "I've been following the operation," the Prime Minister said. "You've done something remarkable, Sundar. You didn't just reconnect a village. You reminded the whole country what leadership looks like." Sundar was silent for a moment before replying, "Sir, leadership means nothing if it doesn't serve." There was a pause on the other end. Then Modi said quietly, "I couldn't agree more." But as Sundar turned toward the village again, his heart suddenly froze. Through the rising mist, he saw something that made his breath catch. A faint orange glow spreading across the far horizon, followed by the sound of distant shouts. Someone yelled, "Fire! The transformer exploded!" And just like that, the moment of peace was shattered. People began to run. Soldiers grabbed their equipment. The flood had ended, but a new disaster had begun. Sundar stared into the growing flames, his mind racing. The rescue wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. Fire in the rain. The sudden burst of orange light tore through the dim evening sky like an open wound. Smoke rose in thick, choking waves, curling against the gray clouds that still dripped from the passing storm. The villagers screamed and scattered as the glow intensified, spreading fast through the lower valley where the floodwaters had begun to recede. Sundar stood frozen for a moment, the reflection of the flames flickering in his eyes. After hours of struggle against water, nature had turned cruel again, this time with fire. Without a second's hesitation, he sprinted downhill through the mud, shouting to the rescue team, "Bring the extinguishers. The emergency pumps, anything we can carry." The soldiers followed, carrying hoses and gear. But the flames were already devouring the wooden structures that had been weakened by rain. The transformer that had finally brought electricity back to the region was now the source of destruction. Sparks danced wildly in the air, catching onto roofs, fences, and wet grass that hissed as it began to burn. As Sundar reached the edge of the fire, the heat hit him like a wave. The smell of smoke and damp wood filled his lungs. Villagers were trying to form a line, passing buckets of water from the nearby river, their faces smeared with soot and tears. Some of the older men were coughing heavily, while children clung to their mothers in fear. Sundar grabbed a bucket himself, ignoring the shouts of his team to stay back. "Keep moving," he yelled over the roaring wind. "Don't stop until it's out." The rain began to fall again, thin, hesitant drops that hissed as they touched the fire. The storm, which had caused so much destruction, now returned as if to help heal what it had broken. Sundar moved from one burning wall to another, pulling debris aside, calling out to trapped villagers. The heat stung his arms. His throat burned, but he didn't slow down. His shoes slipped in the mud, his hands blistered, yet he pressed forward, guided by something stronger than fear. In the middle of the chaos, he heard a cry, a woman's voice screaming for her child. Sundar turned toward the far end of the street, where a small house had collapsed. Through the smoke, he saw a hand sticking out from beneath the wreckage. Without thinking, he ran toward it, his heart pounding. He could hear the soldiers calling after him, but he didn't listen. Dropping to his knees, he began to pull away the broken pieces of wood and stone. Every second felt like an eternity. The heat from the nearby flames was unbearable, but he didn't stop until he finally freed a small boy, coughing and gasping for breath. Sundar lifted the child in his arms, wrapping his jacket around him. The mother ran forward, tears streaming down her face. She fell to her knees, sobbing, clutching her son. Sundar placed the boy in her arms, whispering, "He's safe now. Hold him close." She looked up at him through the smoke, her lips trembling. "You're not from here," she said softly, "but you saved him like he was your own." Sundar smiled faintly, his chest heaving from exhaustion. "Every child is our own," he said quietly before turning back to the fire. Hours passed before the flames finally began to die. The rain grew heavier, soaking the ashes, calming the smoke. Exhausted villagers sat on the ground, covered in soot, watching the glow fade into steam. Sundar stood at the center of it all, his clothes torn, his face streaked with ash, but his eyes calm. The soldiers approached him, one of them handing him a bottle of water. "Sir, the fire's under control," the man said. "No major casualties." "We were lucky." Sundar nodded slowly, wiping his hands. "Not luck," he said quietly. "Unity." His mother approached through the mist, her shawl wet but her face steady. She placed a trembling hand on his arm. "You could have been killed," she whispered. "You risked your life." He looked at her, his voice low but firm. "Amma, when people look at me, they see power, success, privilege. But that's not what matters. What matters is what we do when no one's watching, when everything falls apart." She didn't reply. She just smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with pride and sadness. "You've changed," she said softly. "The world gave you power, but you came back with something greater." "What's that?" he asked gently. "Compassion," she said, "and courage that listens to the heart." The villagers gathered around him, thanking him, blessing him. Some brought garlands of marigolds and draped them around his neck. One old man folded his hands and said, "We thought no one would come. But you came yourself. Not as a rich man, not as a leader, but as one of us." The rain continued to fall, gentle now, almost cleansing. Sundar looked at the faces around him, tired, weathered, but filled with new strength. Something deep inside him shifted again. He realized this moment wasn't just about disaster relief. It was about restoring faith. People had seen that humanity still had leaders who didn't hide behind titles or technology, but who stood in the mud and fought beside them. Later that night, as the fire finally went out and the last rescue truck departed, Sundar sat beside his mother on the steps of the community hall. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, but above them, the stars had begun to return, faint but clear. His mother handed him a cup of tea, its warmth cutting through the damp air. He took a sip and closed his eyes. For a brief moment, everything felt still. "You know," he said softly, "when I left this village, I thought success meant leaving all this behind. But tonight I understand that real success is bringing light where there's darkness." His mother smiled, her eyes full of quiet wisdom. "Then you finally learned what your father always wanted you to know." Sundar turned toward her. What was that? She looked out toward the faint smoke rising over the hills. That a man's worth is not in what he builds for himself, but in what he rebuilds for others. Those words settled deep in his heart. He looked up at the stars again, the same stars he had stared at as a boy, dreaming of the world beyond the clouds. But tonight he didn't dream of leaving. He dreamed of returning, of giving, of building bridges that went both ways. And then, just as peace began to return, one of the soldiers approached hurriedly, whispering something in his ear. Sundar's expression changed instantly. Are you sure? He asked. The soldier nodded grimly. His mother noticed the shift in his face. What is it, Sundar? He looked at her slowly. There's something else, he said quietly. The flood wasn't just caused by the rain. They found evidence that one of the nearby dams might have been tampered with before the storm. She frowned. Tampered by who? Sundar stared into the darkness beyond the hills, where the water still shimmered faintly under the moonlight. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it now. Someone knew this would happen. And as the wind picked up again, carrying the faint smell of smoke and earth, Sundar felt it deep in his bones. The crisis wasn't over. What had started as an act of nature was beginning to look like something else entirely. And he knew one thing for certain. The truth would test him more than any storm ever could. The hidden hand. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the hum of insects and the distant dripping of rainwater from broken rooftops. The fire was gone, the storm had passed, but the unease in the air refused to fade. Sundar stood near the edge of the valley, staring at the faint outline of the dam in the distance. The moonlight shimmered across its surface, calm and still. But he knew now that the calmness was a lie. Somewhere behind those walls, someone had played with fate. The soldier beside him handed over a folder, a report compiled by engineers and local officials who had examined the structure. The words on the page made Sundar's stomach tighten. The flood hadn't been caused entirely by natural forces. The water release valve, which was supposed to open gradually, had been forced open all at once during the storm. It wasn't a system malfunction, it was deliberate. Someone had overridden the control manually. Who had access to the control systems? Sundar asked, his voice low. The officer hesitated. Sir, it was connected to the regional digital grid. Only authorized engineers or contractors with clearance could do that remotely. The trail leads to a private subcontractor, an agency involved in maintenance under a larger tech partnership. Sundar's eyes narrowed. Which partnership? The soldier hesitated again. One of the companies supplying automation systems. Foreign-backed but approved locally. We're still tracing the data path. Sundar looked down at the valley again, the faces of the villagers flashing through his mind, the children who had almost drowned, the homes swallowed by water, his mother standing in the ruins of her life. This wasn't just negligence. It was manipulation. Somewhere, someone had chosen profit or power over human lives, and that thought burned deeper than the fire had. He turned away from the dam, his jaw tightening. Get me to Delhi, he said quietly. Now. The helicopter took off before dawn, slicing through the morning haze. Below, the villages looked peaceful again. But Sundar knew that peace could be as fragile as glass. His phone buzzed continuously. Messages from the Prime Minister's office, engineers, and journalists. Word of his rescue efforts had gone viral. Millions were praising his leadership, calling him a hero. But Sundar felt no pride. Not yet. He had seen what lay behind the curtain, and he couldn't rest until he knew who had pulled the strings. When he arrived at the Prime Minister's residence, Modi ji was already waiting. He looked more alert than he had in days, though his face was grave. I read the report, he said as Sundar entered. You were right to act fast. If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a technical failure, it's sabotage. Sundar placed the folder on the table between them. Someone used our technology against our people. And if the system logs are accurate, they used a security key issued through an official partner channel. That means corruption inside the chain. Modi ji leaned back, his expression thoughtful. We built these systems to empower our citizens, to connect villages, improve safety, and now the same systems are being turned into weapons. Progress without ethics is destruction, Sundar said quietly. The question now is who benefits? The Prime Minister looked at him steadily. You think it's political? Maybe, or financial. Maybe both, Sundar paused. But whoever it is, they underestimated how closely technology and morality are linked. If they think they can hide behind screens, they don't understand how truth works. For the next few hours, they worked in silence. Reports, data trails, encrypted transmissions all laid bare across the table. One by one, the connections began to form. A small technology firm in Gurgaon had been subcontracted to monitor the dam's automated release system. The firm had recently received funding from an unknown overseas investor. 2 weeks before the flood, they had pushed a software update that changed the dam's response protocols. No one had noticed the anomaly until now. They hid it inside the code, Sundar murmured, scanning the report. Just a few lines, but enough to take control remotely during the storm. Modiji's hand tightened into a fist. And because of that, families lost everything. Sundar looked up, his eyes calm but burning with conviction. We can rebuild homes. We can restore systems, but we can't allow technology to lose its soul. The Prime Minister nodded slowly. Then let's find the ones who did this. And when we do, we'll show them that progress without compassion is not progress at all. 2 days later, the investigation team traced the hackers' trail to a rented office outside Delhi. By the time the police arrived, the place was empty. Only servers remained, still humming, filled with fragments of corrupted code. Sundar was there too, standing in the dim glow of monitors, staring at what had been left behind. On one of the screens, a message appeared as they powered it on. The flood washes away the weak, only the strong rebuild. The words chilled everyone in the room. Sundar stared at the line for a long time before replying softly, "Then we'll prove that the strong are those who protect, not destroy." As the servers were taken for forensic analysis, Sundar stepped outside. The city buzzed in the distance, unaware of how close it had come to disaster. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through messages from the villagers, photos of them rebuilding, children returning to school, his mother's smiling face surrounded by neighbors. Hope was alive again, but deep down he knew that this wasn't the end. The attack on the dam had been a test, a warning. That night he sat by his hotel window overlooking the lights of Delhi. The rain began again, tapping softly against the glass. He thought of everything that had happened. The flood, the fire, the rescue, the revelation. Every part of it felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle he was only beginning to see. The world was changing faster than humanity could keep up, and the same tools meant to unite people could also destroy them. His phone buzzed again. A message from Modiji. "The council wants to meet tomorrow. They want you to lead the new National Ethics and Technology Initiative." Sundar stared at the message for a long time, then typed a simple reply. "I'll do it. But I'm not leading a program. I'm starting a movement." He put the phone down and looked out at the city lights. They shimmered like stars scattered across the earth. Somewhere out there were people who thought compassion made a man weak. They were wrong. Compassion was the foundation of every great nation, every lasting invention, every true leader. And as the thunder rolled faintly in the distance, Sundar whispered to himself, "We've built machines that can think. Now it's time to teach them to feel." The next morning would mark a new beginning, a summit where the world's eyes would turn to Delhi, where SundarPichai would stand before leaders, scientists, and dreamers to deliver a message that could redefine how humanity shaped its future. But he didn't know yet that someone else was watching him from the shadows, waiting to stop that message from ever being heard. The speech that shook the world. The morning sun rose softly over New Delhi, its golden light washing the white marble of the convention hall where the world's most powerful leaders had gathered. Banners fluttered in the mild wind, bearing the emblem of India's new global summit on ethics and technology. Camera crews filled the plaza. Journalists whispered predictions and the air buzzed with quiet anticipation. The news had already spread across continents. SundarPichai, the CEO of Google, was set to give a speech unlike any he had ever given before. Inside the hall, hundreds of faces turned as Sundar entered, his calm presence commanding the room without effort. Modiji stood near the stage greeting delegates, his eyes catching Sundar's for a brief moment. There was no need for words between them now. Both knew what was at stake. The world had seen progress. It had admired innovation. But it had also begun to fear it. What Sundar was about to say could change how humanity viewed its own creations. As he walked toward the stage, a small voice in his earpiece whispered from the security team, "Sir, we've received a potential cyber threat alert. Anonymous transmissions attempting to access the summit's live feed." Sundar stopped briefly, taking in the message. "Keep the systems offline until I'm ready to speak," he said quietly. "No one hijacks this message. The applause began as he stepped up to the podium. Flashes of cameras lit up the hall like lightning. Sundar looked at the crowd, at the leaders, the scientists, the engineers, and the students sitting in the back rows. The next generation watching him with wide eyes. He took a slow breath and then he began, his voice calm but carrying a depth that silenced the room. "When I was a child," he said, "I dreamed of building things that could change lives. I believed technology was light, pure, powerful, unstoppable. But I've learned something over the years. Light can blind as easily as it can guide." The hall grew still. Every word seemed to echo beyond the walls. Sundar continued, his tone measured but heavy with truth. "We built systems to connect the world, but in our speed we forgot to connect hearts. We created intelligence that can solve equations but not yet understand pain. We built machines that know everything but have forgotten how to listen." He paused, looking down at his hands for a moment, then back at the crowd. "A few weeks ago I stood in a village destroyed by floods. People lost homes, memories, and loved ones. That disaster wasn't entirely natural. It was made worse by human greed, by a few lines of code written without conscience. And as I looked into the eyes of children who had almost drowned, I realized, we are not facing a technological crisis. We are facing a moral one." The room was silent. Even Modiji's advisors had stopped moving. Sundar's words seemed to hang in the air like a prayer. "Technology," he said softly, "must never forget the human behind the data. The day we let machines define us instead of us defining them, we lose what makes us human. Compassion is not weakness, it is our greatest algorithm. Kindness is not inefficiency, it is our greatest innovation." As he spoke, screens around the hall began to flicker. Lines of code appeared, running across the monitors like veins of light. The security team's voices buzzed through his earpiece. "Sir, someone's trying to breach the live broadcast feed. They're flooding the servers." Sundar didn't flinch. He looked directly into the cameras and said, "To those who believe power belongs to the few, who hide behind digital walls to manipulate lives, you have already lost. Because technology was never meant to control, it was meant to serve." The hall erupted in applause, but suddenly the main screen behind him went black. The lights dimmed. A mechanical voice crackled through the sound system. "You speak of humanity, yet you built the system that watches it," it said. The voice was distorted, but the message was clear. "We are the architects now. We decide who deserves progress." Gasps filled the room. The security team scrambled, typing furiously to regain control. Modiji rose to his feet, his expression fierce. "Trace it," he shouted. But Sundar lifted his hand calmly. "Let them speak," he said quietly. "Let them hear themselves." The voice on the speaker grew louder. "Your compassion makes you weak. You think you can save everyone, but progress belongs to those who dare to dominate." Sundar stepped closer to the microphone. His tone didn't rise, but his words carried like thunder. "You misunderstand progress," he said softly. "It is not about domination, it's about elevation. We rise only when we lift others with us." And with that, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small device no one had noticed before. A portable node linked directly to Google's quantum security system. He pressed a single button and within seconds the screens flashed white. A cascade of encrypted signals washed through the network, purging the intrusion, resetting the feed. The distorted voice sputtered once, twice, and then fell silent. The screens lit up again, this time showing live footage of the flood-ravaged villages that had already begun to rebuild. Children smiling, families reconnecting through restored networks, farmers using solar devices to power their homes again. "This," Sundar said, pointing to the screen, "is the real future. Not power, not profit, people." The room exploded into applause. Some were standing, others crying. Modiji's face softened as he clapped slowly, his eyes glistening with emotion. World leaders rose one by one following his lead. Even those who had come as skeptics were now silent in awe. But Sundar didn't smile. Instead, he looked out into the crowd and said something that no one would forget. "Our greatest invention will never be artificial intelligence," he said. "It will be moral intelligence, the courage to choose good even when it costs us. If we can build that, then no darkness, digital or human, will ever win." As he stepped down from the stage, the applause followed him like a wave. Reporters rushed forward, questions flying, but Sundar didn't stop. He walked straight to the exit where Modiji was waiting. "You've done something remarkable today," Modiji said quietly. "You've reminded the world that progress must have a heart." Sundar smiled faintly. "And you reminded me that leadership must have a soul." Outside, the city lights shimmered under the returning sun. It had been raining moments ago, but now the clouds had parted. A rainbow arched faintly over the skyline. A fragile, perfect bridge between storm and peace. Sundar looked at it, thinking of his mother, of the village, of every person who had believed that kindness could still shape destiny. As he stepped into the car, his phone buzzed with a message. It was a photo from his mother. She stood beside the rebuilt community hall, surrounded by children, holding a handmade sign. It read, "The water came. The fire came. But we stayed." Sundar's throat tightened. He leaned back in his seat, watching the rainbow fade slowly into light. He knew the world's battles were far from over. Technology would keep evolving. Challenges would keep coming, and power would always tempt the unworthy. But as long as people remembered the strength of empathy, humanity would never lose its way. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet conviction formed. Strong, steady, and unbreakable. Progress was not about the machines we built. It was about the humanity we refused to abandon. And that truth, spoken on one unforgettable morning in Delhi, would echo through generations, reminding the world that even in an age of code and circuits, the real revolution still began in the human heart.